And also, we've had rising economic inequality since the 1970s. In order to be able to mitigate that with all of the social problems that emerge from that, higher education is a really effective way to do that if it's functioning well. And then also to, I would say, reinvigorate democracy, to expand who's involved in American civic life. That's critically important. My book on the GI Bill really made me very convinced of this, of how powerful this is, because veterans who used the GI Bill to get a college degree became active in many more civic organizations and much more active in political activities in the immediate post-war era than veterans who were similarly situated but did not use the GI Bill. Then I have a former student of mine, Deandra Rose, who's becoming a professor at Duke School of Public Policy, and she looked at student aid policies for civilian students, the National Defense Education Act and components of the Higher Education Act, and found the same thing to be true, and it was particularly important for women who gained access to college because of Pell Grants and student loans, and they became more active in politics as a result. So you expand who's involved in politics, and that makes the United States live up to its ideals more fully.
So in terms of solutions, one of the things that I would get out of this is that you want to, a pretty massive expansion of the Pell Grant program. I mean, it seems, and I'm wondering how realistic that really is in terms of, the funding that we have today.
Yeah. That's actually not what I would lead with. I ultimately, in the final chapter, I talk about what we should do today. And I would say that we need to do all kinds of important things for policy management, first and foremost. So I think it's problematic that today 1 in 4 student aid dollars is going to a sector that's not being very responsible and accountable for expanding opportunity. And so I think before we expand Pell Grants again, we've got to be able to manage that situation. So we've got to deal with the for-profit sector effectively. We also need to look at the fact that there are states that have a perverse incentive to not invest in higher ed. Now, the states have competing demands that come from Medicaid, K-12 education, et cetera. And so they're investing in those things which are mandatory spending, and they can leave higher education aside as discretionary spending and figure if we do less, more federal student aid dollars will actually flow into the state. There's a perverse incentive. And I think we need to look at ways to require the states to have more maintenance of effort in order to get those Pell Grant dollars. And then I also think that looking at the nonprofit private institutions, there's real variation. There are some that will actually really help out students on Pell Grants and give them additional money out of their endowment and to really help make sure that they can make it to graduation. But there are others that do very little for those students. So they borrow a lot of money and they can end up borrowing too much and being in a bad situation. And meanwhile, they're using their own resources to try to game the rankings by giving more merit aid to students with high SAT scores so they'll rise up in the rankings. And I think that we need to find some way to hold them accountable as well. So then ultimately I would say, yes, we should have more Pell Grant spending, but we want it used really effectively to be, for taxpayers want that. Taxpayers are, American citizens generally are supportive of investing in higher ed. They want college to be a route to opportunity for people, but that money's got to be spent in a responsible way.
So I think, one criticism that has come up about the book that I've heard is that it goes a little easy on the colleges themselves. You talk about that tuition rising hasn't been the biggest problem. To be fair to lawmakers, there is a frustration that every time that they raise the maximum Pell Grant, right, colleges raise their tuitions, and so there's no net gain over time. And so I think that this is something that both parties now are, members from both parties are very frustrated with. They feel like they're just going around in circles. I'm wondering what you think of that, how you would respond.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a lot of analysis by economists about, why has tuition gone up so much. And there are reasons for that I'll leave it to them to explain. But I think that it is fair for the federal government to be asking universities and colleges to be accountable in these kinds of ways that I'm suggesting about, expanding opportunity to lower income students and to middle income students as well. What I'm really struck by as you look across American political history is how historically the federal government worked together as partners with the states and with private institutions. And whatever the goal was across different periods of time, they all worked together in concert to try to get to those goals. And I think that we've somewhat lost sight of that. And actually in recent years, since 2007, I think the federal government is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Mm-hmm. And the states and the institutions not necessarily as much or not evenly across the board. And so I think we do need to find ways to hold them accountable.
Okay. In the other criticism that I've seen that's come up was from Andrew Kelly of the American Enterprise Institute, and he questioned whether the bipartisan support for profits in the House of Representatives was a question of plutocracy or whether it was just plain old constituency influence. And I was wondering how you respond to that question.
Well, this is a really interesting dynamic. I was quite fascinated to study the politics surrounding the for-profits because they began to emerge right after, there were some existing before the first GI Bill, but they really took off after the first GI Bill way back in the late 1940s. And immediately there were problems. And immediately there were members of Congress who were saying, these institutions are milking the federal government. And at that point in time, Democrats and Republicans got together and they created some changes for the Korean War GI Bill. So in not too long a period of time, they created some kind of a fix. And then eventually civilian student aid is expanded to the for-profits, and then problems emerged again. And this went on for some time. And what's really interesting is if you look back at the 1980s, the complaints about the for-profits were coming from some Democrats and some Republicans. I'm particularly struck by William Bennett, who was Secretary of Education in the Reagan administration, who said that these schools were acting as diploma mills that were taking advantage of poor people. And then the President George H.W. Bush administration really wanted to try to rein them in, and legislation was introduced by Senators Bob Dole and Phil Gramm in 1990 to try to regulate them in some way. Sam Nunn had all these investigations that were done in 1990 about what was happening, and every single member of his committee, Democrat and Republican, signed the final report and said something has to be done. And finally in 1992, you had some Democrats and Republicans together who enacted some modest regulations. Since then, things have changed. So, it can't be just a matter of constituencies, because the Republican Party, which used to be somewhat divided around them, is now very much lined up in support of them in both the House and Senate. And the way I interpret that is it's the dynamic of polarization. Polarization actually makes influence easier in some ways for interest groups, because it means that instead of having to lobby every single member of Congress, they can go to the leadership. And once they get the leadership on board, then at least that party can step in line. And I think this is what's happened with the Republicans. And then they've been able to focus on the Democrats and getting enough Democratic votes in the House. And they've done that strategically by hiring some former Democratic lawmakers and staffers from Capitol Hill and so on, and getting enough members of the House to step on board that they actually get votes in their favor. So, if you look at who the constituents are, it gets complicated, because there's always the question of, is a member of Congress being responsive to the industry in their district, which, the for-profits tend to be sprinkled across congressional districts, or are they being responsive to students in their district who are being taken advantage of? And I think different members of Congress are responsive, to one or the other. So it's more complicated.
I did find really fascinating in the book the talk about how the parties have changed over time, not just the Republicans, but the Democrats as well. You talk about how the Democrats were much more supportive of both the student loan industry and the for-profits back in the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, I think I see the interweaving of the dynamics of both polarization and plutocracy being at play. And the Republicans have really lined up for this industry. So it's so interesting to me that as recently as the 1980s and early 90s, fiscal conservatism was motivating many in their party to take issue with the for-profits and to see this as wasted money, as an industry that was really milking the federal government, was a term that was often used. And now they've really vacillated away from that. And they will say that they want to reward a sector of higher education that is the private sector. But the problem with that, when you look underneath it, is that here you have an industry that on average, the average institution is of the top 15 or so, is getting 86% of its revenues from the federal government. So it doesn't seem so private. And then on the Democratic side, Democrats more traditionally were defenders of the for-profits, saw them as really helping low-income people. And there are some Democrats who will still make that argument today. And again, there it's problematic when you look at the actual outcomes for many low-income students. But I think you see a divergence in the Senate and House now, where in the Senate, polarization is ruling. And so the Democrats are more and more lining up in some opposition to the for-profits. But that's not happening in the House.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to call up our other panelists, Bob Shireman and Frances Lee, to hear their views on the book and the issues that the book raises. So Bob, do you want to start?
Sure, be happy to start. Thank you so much for your book. It was a fun and interesting read. And I swear I didn't go to the index first to see where I am in the book. But it really made me think not just about, helped me to get out of just the education space and think about education policy from the perspective of what's been happening with politics generally in the country. And I want to start actually with where your conversation with Steve just sort of led to around what I wrote down while I was reading your book. I remember Alan Bloom's old book, and so the title that I came up with was The Closing of the Republican Mind. Mm-hmm. And I thought through kind of my time in policy and thinking about how it used to be that you would have in Congress some left-leaning principles and some right-leaning principles, and then a discussion. And then, of course, interest group politics that then affected the policy that came out. But the good thing was that you had the intersection, that you had that conversation between the left-leaning principles and the right-leaning principles, maybe a market orientation versus an equity orientation. And while that was affected by the interest group politics, the policy at least reflected that conversation. And what it seems like has happened, and I will be very interested in the political scientist sort of view of this, is that those dynamics have changed where the interest group, especially on the Republican side, just kind of predetermined. There's less of an actually principled right-leaning element of the discussion in the first place, and so there's really no discussion at all, and not the compromise that results doesn't have the benefit of the left and the right having that kind of discussion. And so the book really helped me to kind of see how higher education policy, and it has felt like that's happening all over the country and in Congress on a lot of different issues. A few other things I wanted to mention, really just adding to your story. You talk about the quite progressive policies of the Obama administration early on in the administration. And I just thought useful to remind people that during the transition, most of the commentary was that, well, we don't really expect Obama to do much in higher education. It was not much a part of the political campaign that he launched. And I wanted to throw out the possibility that part of the reason that Obama was able to propose such progressive higher education policy is that he was not burdened by higher education or financial aid policies created in the heat of a campaign. And when folks running for office call me and ask me, well, so what should I be proposing in my campaign? I'd say, don't propose higher education policy in a campaign, because if you poll things, and this is what happened with the Clinton and the tax credits, if you ask somebody, should we have a tax credit for higher education, it sounds great. It sounds like it doesn't cost anything. It just sounds like it sounds like apple pie. And if we did focus groups a number of years ago, asking people, well, what should the interest rate be on student loans? And just have them write down, what do you think the interest rate should be? And almost everybody wrote 0 or 1%, which from an economic standpoint makes no sense and basically would cause everyone to just want to take advantage of the program. And those are the kinds of policies that you get when you use polling to create higher education policy. So I think part of what created I'd say you had the lack of a list of higher education policies that had been promised in the heat of the campaign and created by polling. And then you had a very good candidate who really cared about higher education. And I remember early on, it may have been the transition or it may have been early on in the administration, and I knew that the things that you say during the campaign maybe get moderated some once you have to start governing. And the president had said, Obama, the candidate, had been very much in support of the DREAM Act. And I was about to meet with I was working on the transition team, about to meet with some folks who I knew were going to ask me, so what about the DREAM Act? And I emailed over to to Heather Higginbottom, one of the primary campaign people, and said, I'm going to meet with these folks. Can I say we're 100% with you? We're right there. And I kind of thought, I need to ask this because I'll probably get a response that says, well, we don't want to come out first with that. We'll get attacked as only blah, blah, blah. And it would be sort of a triangulation thing. And the response I got back was, yes. It was just go for it. And that's what actually made me think I could actually work for this administration. I could actually move back from California for a little while to work for this administration. So you had the combination of not being burdened by what was decided during a campaign in terms of policy, and I think a good candidate who really cared about higher education and Pell Grants, and was so bold as to, as you said, propose a Pell Grant entitlement. You also make the good point in the book that it's not all about money and power. Sometimes it's about strategy. And you talk about the Sallie Mae alternative to direct lending. And I think you're right that part of the reason that the Sallie Mae proposal didn't get anywhere was that they didn't strategically, they had not brought in the nonprofit fund, loan companies, and we were hearing whispers all the time that that there's going to be a deal's going to be cut, that some mystery person in the White House, it's just going to happen. I think another reason the Sallie Mae deal didn't happen was the details hadn't really been worked out. I mean, folks look at the proposal and trying to figure out how does this actually work, and I wanted to kind of bring to the book that issue of details, because you say at one point in the book, and I wrote down that innovative ideas are rarely in short supply. I think that's true, except that what is often in short supply are details. And even some of the ideas that you kind of end with in the book, rewarding states for doing the right thing, rewarding institutions for a lot of Pell Grant recipients, the details about how to implement, how to actually design those sorts of things. They're good ideas, but it's in the details. Nobody has a detailed proposal, and figuring out the details actually accomplishes two things. One is it gives you something to actually propose rather than just sort of pretending like you have an idea. But it also forces the other issue that you brought out, which is the unintended consequences, to think about, okay, well, if we design it this way, you start realizing when you work out the details, if we design it this way, we might be incentivizing these other kinds of things, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And so perhaps some of the further exploration, so where do you have details, where do you not have details, that issue of details also kind of emerges around some of the for-profit issues where there's a strategy about not having details. So the for-profit colleges like to say over and over again that they should be judged on outcomes rather than inputs, but they never actually propose any details on what how those outcomes should be measured. And when anybody actually does propose any details, they scream bloody murder and act like they're being attacked. Like is happening right now. And so there's actually a strategy about acting like you have an idea, but then you have no details, and so you get the benefit of saying, well, they care about outcomes, but then in fact they have no proposal whatsoever and oppose anything that anybody has actually proposed. So that difference between ideas and details, I think, deserves further exploration. I'll stop there.
Okay. And Frances?
Thanks very much to the New America Foundation for hosting this event on Suzanne Mettler's important book.
It's also the Century Foundation as well.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, the Century Foundation as well. I just want to take a few minutes to underscore a couple of the very important points in Suzanne's book, and then set them in the context of congressional politics more generally. One of the really important points in the book is that policy doesn't remain static even when Congress is gridlocked. The effects of policy can change dramatically as a result of societal or economic changes, even when the laws remain the same. So gridlock just means undirected policy change. It doesn't mean a lack of change. So on the subject of direction, or lack thereof, it's unquestionably true that it's much harder for Congress to act today than it was in the past. The U.S. system of government, with its many checks and balances and veto points, almost always requires bipartisanship to legislate. Most of the important laws that Congress has adopted, it has done so on the basis of large bipartisan majorities. So the problems that Congress faces today in getting bipartisan agreement are new to post-war American government. There should be no doubt that it's much harder today for politicians to work across party lines than it was in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. It's even harder than in the 80s and the 90s. I brought some data for you to examine on a handout, living up to the college professor stereotype, I guess. The party polarization can be seen via very simple indicators, like something like party cohesion. The first figure that I put on your handout displays the average Senate Republican and Democratic Party unity between 1956 and 2010. It just looks at that senators' average loyalty to their party on controversial issues, broken out by Democrats and Republicans separately. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the typical senator voted with his party on controversial issues just over 60% of the time. In the 80s, just over 70% of the time. In the 90s, over 80% of the time. And since 2000, on average, above 87% of the time. The story is the same in the House, as is evident there in Figure 2. Conflict always slows Congress down, and partisan conflict most of all. And as partisan conflict spreads to more issues, the institution's gotten progressively more bogged down. As a consequence, the last Congress got almost nothing done. I also display a simple gauge of legislative productivity, the number of public laws passed in each Congress since 1951. With the passage of only 240 laws, the last Congress was the least productive of the whole time series, and the current Congress is on track to underperform the last. At the end of its first session, it had passed fewer laws than did the 112th. It's been hard for Congress to act on anything, even on low-profile issues that have historically been bipartisan, like farm bills or the Postal Service or transportation policy, cybersecurity. Now, scholars and journalists normally attribute rising partisanship to ideological changes within the two parties. There's no question that each of the two parties have become more ideologically cohesive, more homogeneous internally, and that the preferences of Republicans and Democrats, both at the level of members of Congress as well as party activists, are far more distinct from one another. But what's often overlooked in the focus on ideology is another factor that affects our contemporary politics, and that's its ferocious party competitiveness. The closeness of today's party competition is not normal in American politics. In fact, the last 3 decades have seen the longest period of near parity in party competition for control of national institutions since the Civil War. That's displayed in Figure 4, the bottom of the handout. It displays a simple index of two-party competition at the national level. The measure is just the average of the Democratic Party's share of the two-party vote for president, its share of House seats, and of Senate seats. So those 3 indicators average together the Democratic Party's share. And then I just display the index's divergence from a 50-50 balance. So the closer the bar to 0, the more competitive the decade. Democratic-leaning eras are shown in blue, Republican-leaning eras in red, and the purple bars indicate evenly matched competition. As is evident from this measure, our politics is distinctive today for its narrow and switching majorities. Nearly every recent election has held out the possibility of a shift in control of one institution or another, as we're looking to the Senate elections this fall. Looking back, the period most similar to the present was the Gilded Age, 1876 to 1896. This was another period of close and alternating party majorities in Congress, as well as a ferocious party conflict and low congressional productivity. These changed circumstances have had far-reaching effects on political incentives and on party politics. This increase in two-party competition for institutional control fuels a more confrontational style of politics. The competitive context motivates politicians to show how and why they're different from and better than their party opponents. They have incentives to look for ways to confront the other side, to draw clear distinctions. The result is that the out party has more political incentive today not to compromise on issues, because doing so blurs the differences between the parties to voters. What it wants to do is to highlight the differences, to delegitimize the opposition, and make a case for a change in power. Newt Gingrich ally and House Republican Policy Committee Chairman Dick Cheney explained the logic behind the strategy in 1985. He said, "Confrontation fits our strategy. Polarization often has very beneficial results. If everything is handled through compromise and conciliation, if there are no real issues dividing us from the Democrats, why should the country change and make us the majority?" More and more votes in Congress are staged for the purpose of highlighting the differences between the parties. Lots of votes today are taken on bills that no one has any illusion about becoming law. They're known as message votes. Message votes are not serious efforts to legislate. They're just public relations. But public relations takes up an enormous amount of time in the contemporary Congress. So that's what I would say on the subject of polarization. And it's not just ideological polarization, it's also a reaction to a competitive context that's distinctly intensive. I also want to say a few words about the role of money in American politics. The book traces the difficulties in higher education policy to party polarization and to plutocracy, meaning the dominant influence of moneyed interests in policy making that occurs. There's no question that money's become progressively more important in American politics as the cost of campaigns has exploded. But as with party polarization, part of the story is competition for control of institutions. It's not that there are lots of competitive House and Senate seats. It's that campaigns for the handful of races that are competitive are flooded with money because the stakes are so high. The role of money is not necessarily always counterproductive in American politics. It obviously has a class bias, and a strong one. Wealthy people fund campaigns. Politics more grounded in civic organizations and social movements would likely be more in touch with the needs and wants of average Americans. But when it comes to the question of party polarization, moneyed interests can have a moderating effect, reducing at least somewhat the incentives for endless partisan warfare. American business writ large obviously has a great deal at stake in the functioning and success of America's system of higher education. Generally speaking, business interests don't get that much benefit out of partisan gridlock and partisan warfare. Looking beyond higher education policy, the Chamber of Commerce would like to see more spending on infrastructure. Hospitals would like to see state governments accept the Medicaid expansion. Legislatures that can't compromise can't deliver for these interests. On the other side of the ledger, individual donors, as opposed to business interests, tend to be more ideological in their motivations. Individual donors are becoming a more important part of the campaign finance landscape. These are generally not middle-class people. Even small donors are not middle-class people. But compared to corporate interests, individual donors are much more likely to donate for ideological reasons. Members of Congress with the sharpest ideological profiles have some of the best track records in raising money. The pressing need to seek and to raise money from this source is probably an obstacle to constructive bipartisanship in government. So the effects of money on American policymaking are complicated. On the one hand, plutocracy means that government will be able to do at least some things, albeit things that benefit American economic interests. What's good for American business isn't necessarily beneficial to the rest of the country, but it's not always harmful. Suzanne Mettler makes the case that rent-seeking has been particularly problematic in the higher education policy-scape. Despite the propensity to rent-seeking, politicians doing things that benefit American economic interests can sometimes be helpful to society at large. But when money means cultivating donations from individual donors who are consuming a steady diet of ideological news and opinion, it just reinforces all the most counterproductive incentives in American politics right now.
Okay, well, thank you for both of you. Frances, do you, one of the things that Suzanne argues in her book is that, you know, she focuses on higher education, but she talks about how this is happening throughout different industries. Do you think that has polarization hurt other areas as much as higher education?
Well, it's certainly, the effects are spreading across issues. I mean, there used to be more issues that were somewhat immune from party politics. I mean, historically, appropriations within Congress tended to be an island of bipartisanship, even had a bipartisan staff. But that came under pressure really starting in the 80s. It's been, over time, fewer and fewer issues are insulated from party polarization. In political science, we'll say that more and more issues are getting absorbed into the single dimension that divides Republicans from Democrats. So yes, this affects all sorts of issues that extend beyond higher education. And the primary effect is just the difficulty of legislating altogether.
Okay, Bob, you were a staff member in Congress when I first met you back in the early 90s. You worked for Paul Simon. Do you think that some of these factors were there then? And also, I'm interested in the change in the parties over time. Have you seen that? Do you think that that is also true, that the Democrats have shifted as well?
Well, I definitely recognize, I read the book, definitely recognized the dynamics and the change in dynamics and sort of that feel of what felt like, at least in the early 90s, the ability to have a discussion and to maybe reach a compromise, maybe not reach a compromise, but at least it was a rational discussion based on theories and proposals and ideas, and it has felt more and more like you're walking into a buzzsaw where the folks on the other side of the aisle are required to just slash and burn and not have an actual discussion, and that does feel like it has changed. That I'd also recognized in some changes on the Democratic side. Certainly, the inclination in the early 90s among Republicans and Democrats was, let's keep peace with the banks. And at least as far as the education committees went, let's not upset the for-profit colleges too much. And I would say even Senator Simon was there and almost got into trouble around that. And that has shifted. I mean, I think I still see that in the Democratic Party, but some of the leadership, at least in the Senate, has become more pointed in its criticisms of the for-profits in ways that were not the case in the early 90s.
Suzanne, in the book you talk about, one area where plutocracy didn't occur was when there was actually student loan reform, and they switched from guaranteed lending to direct lending. But you talk about the fact that the polarization and the fact that it was an all Democratic reform has hurt it. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, first, I'd just like to say that when I started working on this book, I did not foresee that we were going to be terminating bank-based lending because, it had been such a long struggle from when these ideas emerged in a bipartisan way in the late 1980s for direct lending. And then I looked at when Clinton introduces it, I see that as a moment when polarization really became exacerbated, when suddenly the waters parted and people were lining up on either side depending upon their party. And so for a long time, that sort of dynamic then seemed in place, and plutocracy was operating as well because there was all of this, campaign spending and lobbying being done by the banks and by Sallie Mae and so on, and trying to prevent reform from happening. But then what was really surprising to me when I'm in the course of writing this book was all of a sudden change became possible. And so here's sort of the hopeful note of the book is that change still can occur. We're not just bound to what political scientists will call path dependency, where you get going down a certain path and then it becomes reinforced again and again and again. That you can actually have a set of political circumstances that line up and make change possible. And so that did happen, around bank-based lending. But I think that to get to your real question, that polarization does even hurt the shape that these reforms take. And so, in that instance, it was really intriguing to me. I remember interviewing a Republican staffer on the Hill and saying, well, why didn't you put forward some kind of an alternative proposal that you could have been happy with and gotten behind? And this individual said to me, philosophically, we were not on board and we just couldn't go there. We knew that the math didn't work for the Sallie Mae proposal, but we didn't want to be part of something else. We wanted just bank-based lending. That was no longer economically feasible. So they didn't engage in it. And so what's really left out is what Bob is talking about, the attention to the details that takes bipartisanship. I think that higher education, it's so striking to see higher education become really subject to polarization because historically it's been an area with greater bipartisanship and where people have been willing to get together and talk about the details, even if they had very different points of view about them, to hear each other out. And I think through that deliberation, you come up with a better product. It's illustrated by another set of policies we haven't talked about, and that is the contemporary GI Bill. So if you go back to the 1980s, there was real bipartisanship that happened around the creation of the Montgomery GI Bill at that point in time. It took 7 years, but there was real bipartisan effort to come up with a good plan. And then that became outdated, outmoded, and it needed to be revitalized, and a long time went by before that happened. Finally, Senator Jim Webb led the effort for that, for what became the post-9/11 GI Bill. But it happened in this really different political environment and with much less deliberation about the details. And so then no sooner was it enacted when it had all sorts of problems with administration, because it's just the kind of thing that, if there'd been more negotiation ahead of time and deliberation, some of those things could have been foreseen and worked out.
And on that one, there wasn't even discussion among Democrats of different committees. I mean, there was no, between the Education Committee and the committee, the Veterans Committee, there wasn't any communication either.
And a real lack of-
So it wasn't just between Republicans and
Right.
Democrats.
Well, I think what happens is that people see the political moment. Okay, we have an opening to get
Right.
this done, and then it gets rammed
Yeah,
through in the
absolutely.
context of polarization because you think,
Don't
well,
slow us down with
otherwise
all those details.
that
Right.
window is going to shut, and we will have missed the opportunity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's true.
Well, I think I'm going to open it up to the room to see if you guys have questions for the panel. Wow, we got some. Why don't I start with you over here? Yep.
Hi,
We,
my name is Ken Sarger. I happen to be a professor at a regional state university. Wow, I probably don't need this, but at a regional state university in the Midwest. And, our faculty are earning less now than they earned in real dollars in 1980. Our students, in fact, our students are on the list of the students who graduate from public universities with the highest amount of debt in the country. It's disheartening to sit here and hear that some of the problems, we're facing, enormous cuts in state spending. Raising tuition is sort of the only way that the university can manage to meet its expenditures. It's disheartening to sit here and hear that the problem is really over on the Hill. That it's, that my students who can't afford to have an internship in Washington, D.C. that's unpaid, are being basically facing this because of things over on the Hill. So my question is, and I haven't read the book yet, but my question is, what should the rank and file do? Like, what do you recommend the students, the professors at these universities who care deeply about higher education do to grease the wheels, to help this situation do better for those who are simply trying to get this access? And let me just point out that the regional state university has been the point of the greatest amount of access for people from underrepresented groups, right? So anyhow, thanks.
Thank you so much for your question, and I'm glad you're here. And I think that it's, institutions like yours that have been particularly important historically for providing opportunity to people. And these are precisely the institutions that we ought to be concerned about and ought to be trying to set things right so that students can attend them without going into such debt. And so that things are functioning better than they are presently. I've been talking a lot about the federal government, but in the book I also address, state governments, and they're pulling away from supporting these institutions. In the middle of the 20th century, not only was the federal government investing in new kinds of student aid, but meanwhile the states were redoubling their efforts and putting huge investments into public universities and colleges. And they continued to do so even after the federal government began to pull back in the 1980s. But it's really been since the early 90s that, at least nationwide in the aggregate, that the states have been pulling back and doing less. And so I like, the direction of your question, asking about what can people do generally, because that's really the note I end up on at the end of the book. The American public gets very much left out of these discussions, and there's a little bit of a tension between the very good point that Bob makes, that the details matter, and engaging the American public. I mean, higher ed policy quickly gets into down in the weeds, kind of wonky kinds of details, and that's not engaging to the public generally. The most active organizations speaking on students' behalf are the organizations representing universities and colleges, but their interests are not always the same as the American public at large and people who have not become college students. And so the question is really how to engage the broader public around these issues. And one of the things that I tell my students is that the period in time when lawmakers were most responsive to young people was when young people were more active in politics. If you look at the 1960s and 1970s, young people were much more active not only in voting but in a whole array of political activities. And then that declined during the 1980s, most of the 1990s. And since 2000, there's been an uptick of young people's involvement in political participation in the 2004, 2006, 2008 elections. And I think it's not an accident that lawmakers have become more responsive at the national level in increasing Pell Grants since that time and so on. I mean, this is how representative democracy works, that when people speak with a louder voice and make their interests known, that elected officials are more responsive. And so trying to revitalize that kind of civic engagement more broadly is really important.
Do you have any thoughts about
I want to underscore the book has some really useful data and discussion around the decline of state aid in higher ed and some of the dynamics around that. And the idea of rewarding states and figuring out how to incentivize state support of higher education is absolutely critical. But somebody's got to put together the details and then rally a coalition around supporting it. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. But it would, I think that's a really important step that needs to be taken.
Okay.
Maybe a bit of a focus on state government also would be appropriate here. It's hard to be optimistic when you look at the constellation of political incentives surrounding Congress itself. And this point about details versus what speaks to the broad public, I think also intersects with the way in which party competition leads Congress to pay less attention to details. I mean, these message votes are designed for public consumption. They're not serious. They lack details. They're not staffed out. These are not real policy proposals. They just look like them. And so when you're engaging in campaigning instead of efforts to govern, then the details don't matter as much. And so we're seeing less of a focus on details because of the continuous pressures of campaign incentives.
Okay, back there. Right.
Thank you. I'm curious about your thoughts on the Obama administration's proposals to sort of reform how federal student loan aid is given to schools, talking about using metrics like gainful employment. I'm curious about your thoughts both in general, but also any ideas you might have about what unintended consequences might result. So for example, Dr. Mettler, you talked about universities sort of trying to game this certain metrics in terms of things like rankings and that sort of thing. So I wonder about, if new metrics were tied to things like federal student loans, like what results you might think would happen. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for your question about these the proposed rankings. I imagine there are a lot of you in the room who are spending a lot of time thinking about these rankings and are imagining the unintended consequences that might emerge from them. And I should say, that's not my expertise, and I don't really go there in the final chapter, but really make more calls more broadly about how we need to focus on higher ed in a new way. But I do think on the one hand, I think the rankings are motivated by the right things, in that, as I've been saying, we need to, the federal government, it's right for the federal government to hold institutions across sectors accountable